Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, How Libraries Enable New Discoveries with Text and Data Mining, which is sponsored by ProQuest. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I would just like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to follow along with the presentation materials. Along the right-hand side, you should see a Q&A panel and a chat panel. If you don't, they may be collapsed, and you can click the little arrows beside their labels to open and close them. Please do use the Q&A panel to submit questions to our speakers. At the end of the presentation, we'll take a few minutes to answer as many questions as we have time for. So if you have questions, drop them into that Q&A and we'll get to them. And if you have any technical difficulties, that's what the chat's for. Please send me a note directly through there, and we will troubleshoot that issue with you privately. Today, we're using the hashtag ACRL Choice Webinars during the event. So if you have another screen handy, shout out to us. We're at choice_reviews on Twitter. Also note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version. All right, and our speakers today are Mindy Posinel, Director of Product Management at ProQuest, and Dr. Caleb Rawson, who is the Assistant Professor of Accounting at the University of Arkansas. So with that, I will turn things over to Mindy to kick off the presentation.
Thank you, Mark. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And we just wanted to start with saying thank you. We normally end with saying thank you, but we find ourselves in quite a unique situation these days. And we just wanted to thank you for really the role that you're playing on the front lines in helping your universities be successful in implementing online education and helping your users continue to learn and teach and do research in an environment that we have never really experienced before. As you can imagine, we had reservations about hosting this webinar, but we heard loud and clear from many of our customers that you wanted it to go on as planned, and that sometimes it's great to talk about something other than the current situation. So I want to say another thank you for taking your time to be with us today. But I did want to start with one quick public service announcement, is that we understand that you and your institutions are being stretched in entirely new ways. Please know that ProQuest is ready to help. Contact your account team or visit support.proquest.com. Please follow us on social media and check the ProQuest homepage to stay on top of any new programs to support coronavirus-impacted libraries. With all of that said, I'm going to just get started with our webinar. So today, as Mark mentioned, my name is Mindy Posinel. I'm the Director of Product Management for ProQuest and working to launch our brand new text and data mining solution. I'm honored to have with me today also Dr. Caleb Rawson from the University of Arkansas, who's going to walk through his case study and how he used our new text and data mining tool. I wanted to start off briefly by really just getting us on a level set in understanding what is text and data mining and what are we referring to. Text and data mining is nothing new. It's been around for many years, as you know, but it's really the automated process of selecting and analyzing large amounts of text and data. And by that we mean it's not something that you could do by manually reading the documents one by one to ultimately, in the second step, make these connections, understand these patterns and relationships, and retain all of that knowledge from thousands to millions of documents. With the ultimate goal of text and data mining to be to develop actionable insights and knowledge, novel insights that move technology and science and history and move our communities forward by being able to better predict things, to better understand historical events, all types of different relationships. We also like to refer to this as the three different circles as analyze, connect, and discover. We've broken down the text and data mining process into 5 simple steps, even though none of these steps is simple. The first step, really formulate the research question, is directly up to the researcher in understanding their field of study and what sort of boundaries they'd like to test. If we look at the first 2 steps here, or numbers 2 and 3, really to build a corpus and clean the data. That comes with a lot of different challenges along the way. We've heard loud and clear from our customers, current and in the past, that finding the right data, getting access to it, making sure that its rates cleared, and then cleaning the data so that you have a set that you can actually begin to analyze in a consistent manner is quite extensive and takes an inordinate amount of time. Many of our research partners have told us this can take them anywhere from 3 to 6 months. Our goal is really to help our researchers spend more time in the 4th and 5th step, really doing the analysis, gaining insights, and creating those novel discoveries. We really want to help researchers get back to research. And as a role as ProQuest and our librarians, how do we do this so that we are able to provide access to that content where they can derive more value in a better amount of time, more efficiently, in order to drive our institution and student success forward? So why do we need text and data mining? This is something we all know, but I just wanted to bring forward really the point about different types of data that are out there today that we haven't typically thought about commingling or co-analyzing. If we think about Twitter data and doing sentiment analysis combined with current newspapers, historical newspapers, current scholarly journals, blogs, open access materials, even transactional data, everything we do in our environment today is tracked and data is collected. So how do we bring together all of these important pieces of information to develop the best insight and most comprehensive data set that we can in order to help our researchers be the most efficient and most knowledgeable and be on the forefront of their disciplines? So with that in mind, ProQuest has worked over the past probably close to 4 years in developing a text and data mining solution. Our solution is called ProQuest TDM Studio. We've worked with many development partners, and Caleb at the University of Arkansas is one of those development partners, and is going to walk through his experience with TDM Studio. We also have early adopters and about 40 different current projects going on within TDM Studio that we're supporting. Our researchers have given us all sorts of feedback about how to improve the product to ultimately improve their workflow. Our goal is really to make the process as efficient as possible for our researchers and help our libraries derive as much value as possible out of the current subscriptions and open access content that they have available to them. We heard loud and clear probably these 5 main pain points, and I'll talk about each one in the benefit in TDM Studio and how we're able to address those pain points. The first one, and why we're here today, is really to talk about library engagement. Wanting the library to be seen as a point of service and a service provider, leveraging the knowledge and content available within the library across disciplines. We've seen different libraries develop programs that reach across campus, from bringing together information across disciplines and researchers together to share knowledge on how they're approaching text and data mining, to share techniques, for the library to also consult on the techniques that they've seen work best, the content that also is best suited for the research, also making sure the difficult task of rights clearance, making sure all of that is in compliance so that a university doesn't get shut down for searching on certain programs in order to meet the needs of the text and data mining researchers. And as you'll hear with Caleb, with the University of Arkansas, in institutions with our development partners where the library has been actively engaged, have been our most successful projects. And Caleb's library with Joel and Austin have been very actively engaged in the project, in consulting and understanding the needs of the researchers working within text and data mining and TDM Studio. What we also see is, I talked about the inefficiencies and difficulties in collecting and formatting content. That also includes rights clearance, gaining access to the content, collecting it, formatting it. Like I said, many of our development partners really talk about the amount of time being anywhere from 3 to 6 months spent on this collecting and formatting content. Our goal is really to provide efficiency to that process. And when we launch on April 15th, you'll really see, and you'll see with some screens towards the end, about how there's a very clear interface on the data that you have access to, being able to choose those titles, and then within hours instead of months, having access to programmatically analyze that data. Another one we hear about, because many times our researchers are working in teams, the collaboration, whether it be within a university or beyond the walls of the university with other university partners, sending files back and forth to team members can be inefficient. It can also create some inefficiencies due to being out of sync with one another, not understanding that I made changes but forgot to update the file. Our data collections are out of sync, really providing an environment where collaboration is easy, in real time, having access to the same data, and being able to collaborate beyond the walls of your university has been very helpful for many of our development partners. Sought after content is really, when we talk about finding the right content, typically you've had access to perpetually licensed content, open access content, but some of the current subscriptions, including newspapers and scholarly journals, has been very difficult to access. Here we've gone out, negotiated the rights on behalf of our users, and implemented a technology where you can gain full access to the full text and ultimately have the flexibility to write using programming languages, scripts against that content that's as flexible as your research question, using those programming languages of R and Python. And with these developments, our universities and libraries also requested TDM needs that need to be addressed across the university, whether that be rights clearance across the university, whether that be sharing information across disciplines within the university, or also providing a tool where different skill levels of researchers have the same capabilities to perform text and data mining, whether that be for research to get a quick glimpse at the data set that you're proposing for your research, or to execute in a classroom for teaching and learning. We'll talk further about our roadmap and how it also addresses the capability to address text and data mining needs across the university. And just before I hand it over to Caleb, which is really the exciting part of the presentation, I just wanted to reemphasize that our goal is really not to change the research workflow. It's really to make the research workflow more efficient and productive for our researchers. From selecting content, whether that be ProQuest content, open access content, patents, and user uploaded data that you may have already done analysis on, to the second phase of really performing the analysis. We provide some methods and techniques to execute text and data mining, but really with the flexibility to generate your own, or you have some scripts, your researchers have some scripts that they already prefer in R or Python. They can edit those, they can create them, they can upload to ultimately manage the results and export findings. To then, the next step is really to publish. Our goal is really to provide support from beginning to end of the research process and also have the library be seen as a service center throughout this entire research workflow. With that said, I will hand it over to Dr. Caleb Rawson and have him walk us through his case study and his experience with TDM Studio.
Good afternoon. As Mindy said, I'm an accounting professor at the University of Arkansas, and I found that when people find out that I research accounting, I normally get two responses. The first is something along the lines of, I didn't know you could get a PhD in accounting, which is fair. There really aren't that many of us. The second, though, is normally, I'm so sorry, that sounds really boring. And I found that that response stems from a slight misunderstanding of what accounting is. So I wanted to start with a little bit about what my research is and how that fits in with accounting. At a top level, accounting is simply the process of measuring and communicating information about what goes on at a company. The measuring part is the bookkeeping side of accounting, and it's what most people think of. It's the debits and the credits, the nitty-gritty details of accounting. But accounting is also the process of taking that information and getting it to the people who need to know it, whether that's management, investors, lenders, or regulators. And most of my research is focused on this part of accounting, or the why of communication. Trying to understand why firms disclose trade secrets and proprietary information, or why firms only sometimes provide press releases about major events, or what some of the ramifications are of how some of these firm communications are actually worded, and some of the ramifications that go along with that. So to do this, I draw a lot on research in psychology, communication, and economics, as well as some of the more traditional business fields like management and finance as well. From a researcher perspective, news coverage can tell me two things. The first is it tells me how people are paying attention, how many people are paying attention to and know what's going on at a firm. So if a firm puts out a press release, but it's never picked up by any news source, does it really matter that much? The second is looking at specific words. News coverage can tell me how an external party perceives the firm or key executives, which can really be useful in a variety of contexts. Historically, though, the use of media or news coverage within accounting and other business fields has been really limited to either using hand-collected samples for just a handful of firms or using aggregated data that really doesn't allow the researcher to exploit the underlying text of articles. So some of the main data sets that I've been working with in the past would tell me that there is a news article from a specific news source on a certain day about a company, and it might even tell me whether or not it's good news or bad news, but anything beyond that, I can't actually access. I don't know what event it was about, or how long the article was, or what time of day it came out, or what the words are, and it really restricts my ability to exploit what's actually going on in the media by looking at the actual articles here. So the goal of the specific project that I've been using ProQuest TDM Studios for is trying to understand why firms talk about their trade secrets and proprietary information. Generally, when disclosing a piece of information, you want to make sure that it's not a secret, that it's not proprietary, that rival firms won't be able to use that information to hurt your firm, duplicate your research, or anything along those lines. In this project, I argue that since it's really hard to know how costly talking about a trade secret would be beforehand, individual manager perception matters a lot. So drawing from some of the research in psychology, the paper kind of builds off of the view that overconfident CEOs are going to think that the disclosing trade secrets isn't that costly because, at least in their perspective, they run the best company, they have the best scientists and their rivals are all really lousy and wouldn't know what to do with the information. Or at least that's what they believe. I call this the Elon Musk effect. Everybody knows what projects Tesla is working on, and rival car companies can and do use that information to put extra effort into competing with Tesla. So for example, when Tesla announced they were working on an electric pickup truck, Ford had already been working on it for some time because Elon Musk had been tweeting about it for years, saying that's one of his eventual goals. But it doesn't really matter to Elon Musk because he's Elon Musk and all of his competitors are not. Nobody in Elon Musk's mind can really compete with Tesla. So the problem then for me becomes, how do I identify which CEOs are overconfident? Prior studies select a few CEOs and then read every single news article about them, trying to figure out whether the media portrays the CEO as having an optimistic outlook, or if specific CEO quotes and articles indicate that they're confident about themselves, their firm, or the future. But I really didn't want to have to do this. The first reason was I wasn't confident that I'd be able to gather every article from every relevant source, and that I would thus run into some data integrity issues by having a biased sample of underlying news articles. The second is, frankly, it sounds super boring, and I just assume try to automate as much manual labor and manual research work as I can. So knowing that there were data sets out there that had the actual news article coverage, and I'd used ProQuest Central before to look up 1 or 2 articles at a time, I figured there must be some way to automate the process. So I reached out to the business librarian here at the University of Arkansas, who put me in touch with Joel Thornton, who was at the time the head research librarian here. And he tipped me off that we were working with ProQuest to test out the TDM Studio and got me set up and ready to go and be one of the initial testers for ProQuest. And throughout the process here, the library here has been extremely helpful in facilitating the back and forth with ProQuest as questions and initial hiccups and issues came up early on with just trying to access the data. But the library here has been super helpful, and ProQuest has been extremely responsive to any of the issues I've had that have come up along the way. So I initially gave ProQuest a list of about 2,500 CEO and firm pairs and a list of major business news sources to draw from. And this resulted in a lot of articles, so 323,000 articles, which is a lot to read and way more than I was going to ever read by hand, which was exactly the point of doing this way. But I found as I was going through some of the articles that a lot of them only mentioned the CEO in passing or were classified ads. So you can imagine that if an article is covering the classified section of the Chicago Tribune, the odds of both Apple showing up, as in an Apple iPod or Apple iPad, and jobs showing up on a classified page would be really high. So I needed to figure out some way to clean out any of these articles that weren't actually about the CEO. And since I was really interested in trying to keep articles that describe the CEO as either being confident or cautious, my initial solution was to drop every article that didn't contain a phrase like confident or cautious. And so I had a list of about 20 phrases that I used to do the initial parsing of the data. And this helped reduce the sample to being right around 60,000 articles, but I still ran into a lot of issues and articles that weren't quite what I needed to be, wasn't quite what I was looking for. So for example, there was a Fleetwood Mac cover band in Chicago in the early 2000s whose lead drummer's name was Smith. Well, that wasn't exactly what I was shooting for when I was trying to find articles about CEO Smith at Fleetwood RVs, which is a public company that manufactures RVs. Also, I ran into issues where articles about the Three Musketeers movie would be pulling up instead of articles about Elon Musk. Once again, not quite what I was looking for, but it's in the right, it's part of what goes along with doing textual analysis work. So the solution here was to further cleanse the data by saying if the article didn't contain a word like CEO or chief or executive, I wasn't really interested in keeping the article here. And so this ultimately resulted in there being a little over 22,000 articles that mentioned CEOs at public companies with a word that described the CEO as being either confident or cautious, which ended up being the final sample for this study. These 22,000 articles, once again, are way too many to read by hand, and that's exactly the point here. And that's exactly the benefit of working with large-scale textual data. So for each article, I classify it as describing the CEO as being either confident or cautious based on the words that are appearing in the article around the CEO's name. So for example, in early 2001, Bruce Claflin was the CEO at 3Com, and the New York Times did an article about him. And it was about how the economy was in an economic slowdown with the post-2001 dot-com bubble burst. But what really gnawed at Mr. Claflin, the article said, was that his wife preferred to believe the less gloomy outlook offered at the time by John Chambers, the chief executive of 3Com's rival Cisco Systems. My wife loved me, she said she loved me, but that John Chambers knew a lot more than I did, he recalled. Then it was personal. So besides being a nice little funny anecdote here, what this article tells me is it tells me that Mr. Claflin has a gloomy outlook about the future, both broadly about the economy, but also specifically about his tenure at 3Com. And that's in contrast to CEO John Chambers, who's also in my data set, who has a less gloomy outlook. So this article can provide some insight into the personalities of both Bruce Claflin as well as John Chambers. So another example, Marissa Mayer over at Yahoo in 2015 also had a profile piece done by the New York Times, and it went on to say that the businesses that Ms. Mayer had created or acquired were growing at an annual rate of 80%. She also said that she expected overall growth to begin this year, which is pretty much in line with her original optimistic timeline. So once again, what this profile piece on Ms. Mayer tells me is that she has an optimistic timeline, that it's been successful, but that ultimately she continues to be optimistic and confident about her tenure at Yahoo and the future growth of Yahoo. So one of the things I can then do with this is I can actually plot out how many articles are about the CEO at a public company that describe the CEO as either being confident or cautious. So in the early 2000s at Yahoo, Terry Semel was the CEO, and especially in 2001 when he first came into office, in 2007 when he left, there was a huge peak of articles describing him as being confident. And this is a broader trend that I see throughout the data, is that both in the first and the last year, there tends to be a lot of news coverage about CEOs, and that's when there tends to be a lot of profile pieces describing the CEO's tenure, their goals, their plans for the future. But one of the things that struck me when I was looking at this chart was that Jerry Yang in 2008 had a huge amount of articles written about it, or at least that's what the data would imply. But what was odd about it is Jerry Yang was an interim CEO for only a couple months in 2008, so it seemed unlikely that there would actually be 15 articles and profile pieces written about it. But in 2008, there was another major event going on in the world, and that would be the Olympics in Beijing in 2008. Also in 2008, Yahoo was rolling out their sports reporting desk, where their articles were getting picked up by various news sources across the country. So for example, the LA Times in 2008 had a profile piece about the Chinese men's gymnastics team, and at the bottom had Yahoo Sports Reporting. So there were a lot of these articles in 2008 because when you're talking about Olympic athletes, you're talking about people who are very confident about their own abilities. And if Yahoo Sports Reporting is picking up a lot of the articles, is inadvertently flagging these articles as being about the CEO. So ultimately, the ProQuest TDM data that I ended up working with wasn't quite as perfect, but nothing ever is, and that's part of what comes with working with text data, and especially with working with massive data sets in the tens or even hundreds of thousands. But what's key about this is it allows me as a researcher to determine how to clean the data and at what point to say it's good enough. Since each study is going to be slightly different, these decisions will naturally change between different projects. So for this specific project, I got to a certain point where I said the errors that are remaining are probably random. And as long as that's the case and they're not associated with what I'm looking at, that's sufficient. There's going to be errors in the data, but they're sufficiently random that it's not concerning. Ultimately, I was able to classify over 2,200 CEOs, which was around 3 times what prior studies had done through hand collecting. And I was able to do it in a matter of about a week once I got all the data ready to go. And what I found was that these overconfident CEOs ended up talking more about their trade secrets and R&D activities, which led to both better performance of rival firms who were able to use the information and worse performance of their own firm because they no longer had a first mover advantage of working on information research projects without their competitors knowing. So I'm really excited about using the data in ProQuest TDM Studio in future studies to better understand how news coverage and firm disclosure decisions interact with each other. So for example, trying to understand how the media covers major firm events like CEO changes, and whether initial media coverage of a CEO is indicative of future performance. Can this media actually perceive future CEO or firm failures or successes? We don't know that yet, and this is a data set that would allow me to be able to look into that. Or even more broadly, trying to understand how firms respond to negative media coverage. Do they issue press releases about the same event? Do they try to distract from the negative event? Do they ignore it? Why might they have different strategies in different cases? That sort of information. So I'm really excited about TDM Studio. The library here has been instrumental in getting me set up. The technicians over at ProQuest have been extremely responsive to the litany of kind of questions that I've had as I'm working with the data. And I'm optimistic that this will lead to me using the ProQuest TDM Studio in various future projects. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mindy here.
Thank you, Caleb. So I think that's great to hear about an actual use case. As I said, we're getting ready to launch TDM Studio on April 15th, and we've worked with a lot of different researchers and a lot of different universities across different disciplines. I think when we first launched, we thought we would see a lot of your typical digital humanities, but we saw a lot of pickup in business, economics, accounting, even healthcare, history, amazing the different types of disciplines that have been able to leverage TDM Studio and get quick access to that data. And Caleb might have also mentioned that he's getting ready to publish his results based upon this research. So our goal is really to help, really analyze, connect, and discover all of the different points across ProQuest data and any additional data that might be brought in, like Twitter, as I discussed. So when we launch in the coming weeks, we're really supporting on the right-hand side here of the different skill levels of text and data mining researchers. This is really just a broad representation of different skill levels that might exist across the university, from a beginner who's just getting introduced to text and data mining techniques, to someone who's learning, so is just beginning to grasp the techniques, being able to apply the principles, understand connections, and ultimately derive some insights from that text and data mining tool, to the right-hand side where you have scholars and experts who are typically using programming languages like R or Python, similar to the work that Caleb and his team did within TDM Studio. So for our first release here in the coming weeks, as I mentioned, we will really focus on the right-hand side, meaning those who are using R and Python. And then I'll talk about our longer-term roadmap and how we're also building a solution within TDM Studio that would be useful across all 4 different generalized skill levels in the university. So I'll walk through quickly just some screenshots and where we're headed with TDM Studio. I think in an environment like today, where now we're all working from home or remotely, TDM Studio is a solution where you sign on to it with a named user ID. So you would use your first name, last name, user email when you sign up in order to get started. It does not require IP authentication or any of the associated maybe different types of authentication that may be difficult to access when working from home. You will still be able to access all of the content programmatically that your university subscribes to and is rights cleared. Essentially, once we get you set up with your username and password, you are free to work remotely in this cloud environment, which is a secure environment for the content and your scripts to protect the IP of both. So once you log in, you get to a screen in what we call the Workbench, where, as I mentioned, is a collaboration space for 1 to 5 team members working on the same project. So within this screen, your users can create up to 10 data sets of up to 2 million documents each. You'll see here the capability to begin to create the new data set, and then you'll see a button here to open you have the computing environment, where once you have created the data set, you can begin to do the analysis through the scripting work. So once I click here on Create New Data Set, I'm taken to a screen where I see Choose Publications. So we did a lot of work and inquiring with our development partners about what would be the best flow that works for your current research, and how do you determine what types of data are appropriate to your research. And in many times, those titles are front of mind, whether it be the New York Times, or Nature, or the LA Times, or the American Journal of Psychology. Whatever it might be, they typically knew the title. This list is based upon, number one, what you as a librarian subscribe to, so you don't have to worry about, are they getting access to content? Are they able to leverage the content that we subscribe to? So anything that's within the ProQuest platform. So typically when you go to search.proquest.com would be available here. And the second level of security is really that it's been rights cleared. So we have analyzed the agreements for text and data mining. We have negotiated many of these agreements. There are a few exclusions, but we continue to work through those. So anything you see on the screen, you would clearly have rights to text and data mine. And again, through this environment where you can access no matter where you're located. So once I choose, let's say I choose the New York Times, and then I could choose multiple, doesn't matter. You can mix different types of titles. You don't have to stick just newspapers and scholarly journals. You can mix all different types of source types together. I'm just going to choose one here for simplicity of the example, and then I'm going to choose to refine the content. So from here, I came up with 8,300 documents. Once I had narrowed it, as you can see here, I narrowed it to a time frame. You can also enter search terms. Many times, the research question, you don't want to spend your time analyzing and processing a lot of extraneous data that has nothing to do with your research. So you can enter search terms here, fully supported by Boolean, so you can enter those search terms here to make sure you're getting documents that are relevant to the research question. And unlike your typical discovery service or database discovery service, you're not looking for a single document like Caleb mentioned. You're really looking, this right-hand side is to give you a gut check to say, do these documents look like the types of documents I would expect to see in this data set for my research question? Are they relevant? By just looking essentially at the title and brief descriptive information we see there. You can also begin to refine the data set by different, maybe I'm only looking, I don't want any ads or obituaries, that's not really relevant to my research. I could eliminate those from here, but I'm going to leave those in for what we're doing here, and then I'm going to create my data set. So here, I've created one data set in my Workbench. You can write a description of your actual content so you know what you did or what sort of search terms you might have used. Your search query is preserved here, and this location is once you get into your development environment. You can see that this says completed. Now this one was fairly small with only 8,000 documents, but if you had a data set of 2 million documents, it might take a couple hours, a few hours to process through that. So you would see a status here of pending, and you would come back to check to see when that's completed. Now, months versus hours, I think most researchers are happy to wait that few hours to come back and then begin to access that programmatically through the development environment. So from here, I'm going to access the development environment by choosing to open my Jupyter Notebook. So we chose a Jupyter Notebook, which is an open source integrated development environment that has been very popular across not only digital humanities, but other disciplines, and has probably been the top pick for most of our researchers. We picked it for a couple reasons of its flexibility, its capability to do visualizations and support different languages such as R and Python. So both of those are supported directly within this environment. When you get to what we call the Jupyter Notebook here, you'll have a couple sample scripts that ProQuest has implemented on topic modeling and geographic analysis. You'll have an FAQ in order to get started. You might want to just look at some of the sample scripts in order to see how some test data performs. You might want to take that script and apply it to your particular data set just for an initial cursory view of your data itself also. And then from there, if I look into one of those sample notebooks that I'm talking about, I had a data set on the New York Times. I'm going to write this script here, is provided within the notebook, and it's doing topic modeling across those 8,300 different documents. And here's just one example. I'm not going to go through multiple. I think I have two examples here. This example is really about, as you can see, the topic words here, where it's game and season, yards, giants, play. After September 11th, which you can see is right here on each dot is a day on this particular visualization, there was a hold put on baseball for at least a week after the September 11th event, and then you'll begin to see the increase of the reporting of baseball after that hold was placed. Here's another example where you can see United, Bin Laden, Afghanistan, Bush, clearly reporting on the war itself and the terrorist attack. You can see September 11th here being this dot with minimal, some reporting, but not a significant amount, with a drastic increase after September 11th on these particular terms. And then again, you can begin to say, well, even like the baseball example, was that cyclical? Is that typical for a September? I could compare it to other years. I could begin to understand patterns that happen across a standard September and how September of 2001 was different from that, and begin to connect those dots to ultimately make my discovery and answer my research question. Again, this is really about being able to access this data in full text programmatically using R and Python in order to execute a lot of this analysis within this environment. And then you can export directly from here any of your findings, derivative data, citation data, in order to ultimately make that final piece of the research your publication, or compare it with some other data sets that you might have outside. You can also directly upload. Now, we showed the process how you incorporate ProQuest data, but you can also bring in open access data through the notebook here. Any additional data sets or scripts that you want to import, you can import directly within the Jupyter Notebook. Now, I talked about supporting researchers across the university and being able to provide a solution that also addresses those researchers that don't have programmatic skills in coding, whether it be different languages, they don't have any interest, but they really want to analyze data in a way that will help their research and help them progress in their studies. So here, what we have also been working on for several years is really an interface that simplifies text and data mining for these types of researchers. And this is on our longer term roadmap. I'm hoping to release still yet this year. So if you you subscribe to TDM Studio, this is a feature set that you would automatically inherit. Because it's software, features like this, you would automatically inherit some of this feature and functionality. I would go through the same steps as I did to create a data set. Now, when we first launch, it'll be a smaller set of data. It might just be newspapers and ProQuest dissertations and theses to begin to create some smaller data sets and do some visualizations. So here you can create documents with up to 10,000 or data sets with up to 10,000 documents in them. And then similar to on the Workbench, when you had the capability to go to the computing environment, here we would give you a couple samples of, you could do topic modeling, geographic analysis, or network analysis. Right now we're planning on our first analysis that we would release would be a geographic analysis. And that might look something like this data set that's actually on access to clean water. It's about 2,600 documents that you can see here. And there was a search done across just like how we created the data set. And then we zoom in here to Flint, Michigan. This is already zoomed in to simplify the demonstration here. But you can see that there is a gathering of documents here over Flint. And if you recall, at the end of 2015, there was a Flint water crisis. There would be some variables that the researcher could change or amend or play with to try and understand the connections across the data. You could zoom in over here to this particular location and see what was going on, see if there's any relationship, but ultimately be able to do this through some sample visualizations without having to be able to code, but still be able to thoroughly interrogate large data sets. With that said, really, I mean, TDM Studio is really working to set itself apart by providing access to relevant content. Some of the content that Caleb was working with is very difficult previous to TDM Studio to get access to. It can be expensive. It can be not rights cleared, so there's a lot of back and forth in trying to understand what are the rights. It supports collaboration across researchers working together and longer-term researchers working within TDM Studio across universities, and the flexibility to use your data if you want to import your data or your particular scripts and coding methodology, and then ultimately a solution that works across research, teaching, and learning all the way across the entire campus. I think with that said, I think Caleb did a great job of representing his research and his work with TDM Studio. I wanted to spend just a moment to say a special thank you to Joel Thornton, Austin Wilkins, and Dr. Caleb Rawson for all of the work and input that they have given us to drive TDM Studio forward, and they have been a critical piece of the successful launch of TDM Studio. So now we have about 10 minutes for questions, and ultimately, if you'd like to learn more, have a deeper conversation, we can go into a much more in-depth demonstration if you'd like to. You can visit the website here, find some additional information, reach out to contact us, whatever you think might work for your library. So I will stop there, and you can ask myself or Caleb any questions if you chat in the chat facility.
This is Mark from ACRL and Choice. I just, say thank you so much, and I would encourage folks to drop those questions into the Q&A module there. If you have any for either Mindy or Caleb, and it looks like we've got a few in the hopper already, so I'll start in with some of those. Let's see here. So I think maybe, Mindy, you addressed this a little bit in your presentation, but if we could just be really clear, we have a question here from Christy who says, I'm a TDM beginner. Can you describe securing rights to get the data and what that means? If I understand correctly, everything that comes through in TDM Studio should already have the rights cleared, correct? So anything you find there you can use. Is that accurate?
That's correct. And I think the differentiation I want to make, so a lot of platforms like ProQuest platform, when you go to your library's version of search.proquest.com, there are not TDM rights. That is a discovery service in order to find individual documents to cite and use within your research. So what happens if somebody tries to scrape the site or download an extraordinary number of documents is that service will be turned off for your entire university until we figure out what's going on so that we can make sure that the rights are being abided by. The difference with TDM Studio is that we've gone out and negotiated those rights for the documents that you see in there from ProQuest, and you can import any other documents where it's up to you to secure the rights and commingle for analysis there.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Great. We have a question here from Megan who asks, how many collaborators can you include in a single TDM Studio project?
So right now, a TDM Studio project will support up to 5 different collaborators. And that can be, like I said, from within your university or beyond your university. And the majority of our projects for the members of the team that are actually doing the coding, 5 has been more than enough for the majority of projects.
Okay, great. We've got another question here from Megan. And Megan asks, if you share your project with a collaborator, she has a couple of questions. If you share your project with a collaborator, can they see your other projects? And what if your institutions have subscriptions to different corpuses or different groups of magazines? Would you still be able to share those subscriptions, the entire corpus there, or what happens then if there are differing subscriptions at different universities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we get this question a lot. So academic collaboration under the rights agreement is allowed. So if you invite, let's say you're from University of Michigan and you want to collaborate with somebody at Ohio State University, you would, so University of Michigan subscribes to TDM Studio, and so you're the researcher there and you invite a researcher from Ohio State University. So they would have access through that collaboration to University of Michigan subscriptions, because that's a subscribing institution, and through our license agreement, that is sharing that content is fine as part of academic collaboration. But anything within the studio, so your data sets, your scripts, when you invite somebody into your Workbench, you are sharing all of that data. So they can see your scripts, they can see your data, they can edit it in real time.
Okay, great. And let's see. So this is a question that came through a few minutes ago from Wendy. And Wendy is curious, hi, is it possible to view the individual documents from your data set?
Yes, so I didn't include that in my demonstration just for time purposes, but you can view the XML of each individual document, depending on the year of the document, is an XML. So you can go in and you can view all of the metadata. So that's one of the points I should make clear also, is so you have access to text and data mine any of the metadata associated with the documents, including metadata that's added by ProQuest that you wouldn't typically have access to. And you can see all of those fields, including full text, through the XML in the Jupyter Notebook.
Okay, great. Just looking through the questions here. There are plenty coming in.
I see a good one.
Yeah, go for it.
This one, so Aaron asks, does this only allow data mining for ProQuest publications? Can you add from a source such as Twitter? Another great question. So the flow that I walked you through where you're selecting publications, that's only for ProQuest content, but when you get to the notebook, you can upload Twitter data, you can upload any open access content or any other content that you have the rights to upload. So while the selection process is really just for ProQuest content, you can, within the notebook and in the development environment, integrate all kinds of data within there.
Great, great.
There was a question for Caleb too.
Yep.
Yeah, so Megan asks, what tools or software did you use for your analysis, Caleb?
Yeah, so most of my textual analysis work I did using Python in the Jupyter notebook system that ProQuest has set up on their servers. And so then what I did is I downloaded from an output from the Jupyter notebook, basically an Excel file that had article level data saying there was an article that described the CEO as being confident or cautious on this date. This was the CEO and this was the firm. And from that, I was able to merge it in with the rest of my data sets. I mostly use a programming language called SAS to do the rest of my analysis from there. But all my text data work, I've historically used Python, and ProQuest has it set up for that to be an easy transition.
Great. So we have a question here from Samuel who asks, how far back do the data sets go and how often are new data sets being added?
So that's a great question. So it depends on which subscriptions you have and how far back content goes, depending on if your library subscribes to the historical. I know some of the newspapers go back to the 1800s and maybe some even earlier. It really depends on the data set. Then to the question to how often is the data updated. So if you're subscribing to something like Global News Stream where you have current news, those are updated on a daily basis. So we might be out of sync with the newspaper itself depending on when they send us the feed by 1 to 3 days maybe, but our data is updated on a daily basis. But with that said, when you create your content set, that is a static set as of the date that you create it. If you want to add more data, more recent content, you might go through, do your analysis, you find that you've got the right script and you're finding the right information, and now you want to do it with like any data that has been added since then, you would go back and recreate your data set and run your script against that.
Okay, great, great. Let's see, just sorting through the questions. There are lots of them. And just look through the chat here real quick. So, and maybe this is a question for Caleb here. We have a question from Cosette who asks, can you use the tool to collect data but then mine it using non-ProQuest code? So how does that work?
Yes, and so actually all of my analysis was done using my own code. Because I had some experience with writing Python code before, I knew exactly what I wanted to do myself. And so ProQuest assembled the corpus of data and Some of their code was used to help me create the data set in a format that I needed it so that I could then run my own data mining code on that corpus. So ProQuest does have a lot of useful tools for the analysis and the data mining, but you don't have to use their code if you know what you're trying to get out of it.
All right, great. Well, we are coming to the end of our time here, so I would just say thank you, Caleb, and thank you, Mindy, for your time today. Well, I really appreciate the presentation, really interesting stuff, and really cool to see what you can do with the data mining, and with the text data mining there. So I would just remind folks out there listening in that there's a link to a brief survey there in the chat box. If you could take a minute to fill that out to let us know how we did today, we would really appreciate it. And you can be on the lookout for an email from ACRL and Choice within about 24 hours of the presentation that should provide you with a link to the recording. All right, once again, thank you, Mindy and Caleb. We really appreciate your time today, and thank you everyone out there for listening in.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to everybody for joining with us.